He built an empire on silence, on reading people before they opened their mouths, on knowing, always knowing, exactly who sat across from him. And then a wall separated them. And, for the first time in 15 years, Jeon Kangmin was completely, utterly blind. If you've ever felt like the world decided who you were before you ever spoke, this story was written for you. Hit subscribe, because the stories we tell here will make you feel seen in ways you never expected. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Not unusual for Jeon Kangmin. His phone lived on the nightstand like a second pulse, always ready, always alert. What was unusual was the number. Unregistered. Untraceable. A string of zeros where an identity should have been. He picked up on the second ring. He always picked up on the second ring. First ring was for desperate men. Third ring was for weak ones. Mr. John. The voice on the other end was female. Unhurried. Calm in a way that immediately made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Not from fear, but from recognition. This was not a frightened voice. This was not a begging voice. This was a woman who had rehearsed exactly 0 words of this conversation and was somehow still more composed than anyone who had ever dared dial his private line. I need to speak with you about the Incheon shipment. Specifically, about what wasn't on the manifest. Kangmin sat up slowly. Moonlight cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Hanam-dong penthouse in thin silver blades, slicing across the obsidian floors, making the whole room feel like the inside of a secret. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was low, measured. The kind of low that wasn't quiet at all, it was compressed. "Someone who has been watching your operation for 11 months, she said. "And someone who, tonight, is the only reason you still have one." Jeon Kangmin was 38 years old, and he had not been surprised by another human being since he was 23. That was the year his father, a man who ran his criminal network like a dynasty and his household like a prison, had dropped dead of a heart attack at the dinner table mid-sentence. The surprise hadn't been grief. It had been the sudden, nauseating realization that the cage door was open, that he was free, and that freedom, for someone raised entirely within walls, felt indistinguishable from falling. He had spent the 15 years since then making sure he never fell again. He controlled shipping routes along the western coast. He had quiet partnerships with 3 port authority officials, 1 mid-level prosecutor, and a city councilman whose gambling debts Kangmin owned like a mortgage. He ran legitimate businesses, a logistics company, a chain of private dining establishments, a real estate consulting firm, and he ran them well, not as covers, as actual enterprises. He believed in the principle that the best camouflage was genuine success. He had a reputation for precision, for restraint, for never raising his voice, because he had learned long ago that a calm man in a room full of shouting ones held all the power. He had never met a voice he couldn't immediately file into a category. Until now. "The Incheon manifest," he said carefully, "is handled by people I trust completely." "One of those people," she replied, handed a copy of the internal routing codes to a third party 4 days ago. "The buyer is affiliated with the Haesong syndicate out of Busan. They plan to use the information to intercept the transfer point at the secondary warehouse, not to steal the shipment. To document it. To build a case. Someone in your circle, Mr. John, is not what they appear to be." The silence between them stretched like taffy, thin, tense, almost translucent. "You have proof of this," he said. It wasn't a question. He wouldn't have stayed on the line if he didn't already believe her. "I have the transaction record, a partial audio file, and the name of the third-party courier. I also have the window, 48 hours before the handoff becomes irreversible." Kangmin stood. He walked to the window and looked out over the Han River, dark and glittering below like spilled ink. Seoul breathed quietly beneath him. Millions of people asleep inside their ordinary lives. "What do you want?" he asked. "A meeting," she said. "Not tonight. Not somewhere you choose. I'll send instructions to this number at 6 a.m. Come alone. Come without your people reading your movements beforehand." A pause. "I think you know how to do that." And then she was gone. He stood at that window for a long time after the call ended. His mind, the part of it trained over decades to assess, dissect, and categorize, was moving fast. Haesong. The name alone was a stone dropped into still water. They had been quiet for 2 years, consolidating after a leadership transition that had cost them 3 senior figures in 18 months. If they were moving again and moving specifically against his operation, that changed his landscape significantly. But that wasn't what kept him at the window. It was the voice. He'd heard thousands of voices in his life. He had, in many ways, built his entire career on his ability to read them. The pitch of deception, the cadence of genuine fear, the particular way a person's speech pattern shifted when they were performing confidence versus actually possessing it. It was not a skill he'd ever consciously developed. It was simply something he noticed, the way some people noticed color or music. Her voice had none of the tells he expected. No performance.
No practice steadiness.
No slight uptick at the end of sentences that betrayed someone secretly waiting for approval. She had spoken to him, a man whom grown men navigated around like terrain, with the kind of settled certainty usually reserved for people who had nothing left to lose. Except she hadn't sounded like someone with nothing to lose. She had sounded like someone who had done the math and simply liked her odds. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At 6:02 a.m., the instructions arrived. A single address in Mapo, near the river. A small building, he looked it up immediately, that housed a record storage company on its lower floors and, according to property documents, a private consulting office on the fourth. No listed tenant name. Lease signed through a numbered holding company registered in Jeju. Thorough. Deliberate. The kind of paper trail that didn't hide so much as it politely redirected. He told no one where he was going. He took his personal vehicle, not the one his team maintained, and he drove himself, something he hadn't done on a meaningful errand in 4 years. The morning was gray and cool, the kind of sole autumn morning that felt like the city was inhaling slowly, gathering itself. He found parking 2 blocks away and walked. The building was unremarkable in the specific way that deliberately unremarkable things always are, just slightly too clean, just slightly too quiet for its location. The buzzer panel outside slightly too new for the age of the structure. He pressed the 4th floor button. Take the stairs. Her voice came through the speaker. The elevator has a camera that feeds to the building management system. Stairs feed only to mine. He took the stairs. The 4th floor hallway was narrow and well-lit, with one door at the end painted a shade of gray that matched the walls closely enough that you might miss it if you weren't looking. He knocked once. It's open. What he walked into was not what he expected. He wasn't sure precisely what he had expected. Something sparse, perhaps. Transactional. The kind of space that communicated, I am here to do business and nothing else. What he found instead was a room that felt like the inside of a mind that had been thinking for a very long time. 3 walls were covered in monitors, documents, printed satellite images, and color-coded timelines connected by strings of different weights and hues, not chaotic, but dense, the way a very complex idea looks when someone has been patient enough to make it visible. A long desk dominated the center of the space, covered in open laptops, external drives, and 2 empty coffee cups. A small space heater hummed in the corner. A folding cot was visible through an open door to a back room, neatly made. She had been living here, and at the desk, her back half turned to him as she finished typing something, sat the woman whose voice had kept him awake all night. She was not what he expected. He noticed this immediately. Noticed it the way he noticed everything, with the particular involuntary precision of a man whose survival had always depended on his powers of observation. She was large. Significantly, visibly, unmistakably large. A tall woman with wide shoulders and a full, heavy frame. Her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, wearing a plain, oversized sweater and dark trousers. She moved with a kind of deliberate, unhurried economy. Not the self-consciousness of someone perpetually aware of their body in space, but the settled groundedness of someone who had long since resolved their relationship with it. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were sharp, dark brown, direct, the eyes of someone who had spent enormous amounts of time watching things without being watched in return. She did not look surprised to see him.
She did not look relieved.
She looked like a person who had made an appointment, and the other party had arrived on time. Mr. John, she said, sit wherever you're comfortable. I'll walk you through everything. Her name was Bomi. She told him this the way people state their names when they've decided that concealment is a luxury they can no longer afford, plainly, without ceremony, watching his face as she said it to see if it registered. It didn't. He'd never heard it before. She noted that with a small, private expression that might have been satisfaction. She was 34. She had spent 6 years in financial forensics before leaving her firm under circumstances she described as a difference of opinion about which side of the law our findings should benefit. She had spent the 3 years since operating independently, building information architecture on criminal financial networks, selling that intelligence to parties she vetted carefully. "I don't work for law enforcement," she said, pulling up a document on the closest screen. "I've had approaches. I decline. My interest is in the structure of these networks, how money moves, how information moves, how decisions get made, and by whom. I'm not interested in prosecution. I'm interested in understanding." "Understanding," Kangmin repeated. He was seated across from her, his posture controlled, his expression calibrated to reveal nothing. But his mind was moving quickly, trying to locate her. "What you're describing is intelligence brokering. Among other things." She turned to the screen. "The Haesong approach to your operation began 8 months ago. Not as a coordinated effort, as an opportunistic one. A low-level data broker in Incheon made contact with a figure in their network about 18 months back. The relationship deepened. What began as ambient monitoring became something more targeted when, approximately 6 months ago, your logistics network expanded into the Western Corridor and intersected with a route Haesong has historically considered proprietary." She was precise, technical. She spoke about it the way a surgeon discusses anatomy, not coldly, exactly, but with the specific dispassion of someone whose relationship with the material was fundamentally intellectual. Kangmin watched her as much as he watched the screens. "The person inside your operation," he said. "You have the name." "I have a name. I want to verify one additional element before I give it to you, because the consequences of being wrong are severe, and I don't trade in incomplete information." She looked at him directly. "I'll have full confirmation in 18 hours. I need you to delay the Incheon transfer by 24. Tell your logistics coordinator it's a customs anomaly, that's credible, standard, and won't raise internal flags." "You've thought about this," he said. "I think about everything," she replied. It wasn't a boast. It was simply accurate, and they both knew it. There was a long pause. Outside, Seoul had fully woken up, the distant soundtrack of traffic and morning commerce filtering through the building's insulated walls as a kind of low, muted hum. Inside this room, time felt compressed, the way it always does when two people are negotiating something that actually matters. "Why come to me?" he asked. "With this level of preparation, this depth of documentation, you have options. You could have sold this to Haesong's competitors. You could have leveraged it for your own positioning. Why contact me directly?" She was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the screen, made a small adjustment to something, then turned back. "Because you're the one who loses the most if this plays out the way Haesong intends," she said. "And because, from everything I've studied about how you operate, you're the one most likely to handle the information correctly." A pause. "You don't overreact. That's rarer than you'd think." Kangmin absorbed this. "You've been studying me. For 11 months, she confirmed. Your operation, primarily. But an operation reflects its architect. I know how you think, the rhythm of your decisions, the specific way you weigh speed against certainty." She said it without any self-consciousness, as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to tell someone. "Which is also why I knew you'd come this morning. Alone. Without preparation. Because the information was real and the window was genuine, and you're the kind of person who, when those two conditions are met, acts." He had never been described to himself before. It was profoundly, unexpectedly disorienting. He left 3 hours later with a protocol for the next 48 hours and an encrypted channel for communication. He did not have a name yet. She would send it when she had full confirmation. He had agreed, against every operational instinct, to delay the Incheon transfer. He sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine. He was trying to locate the feeling that had settled somewhere behind his sternum during those 3 hours in that gray-walled room, and finding it unexpectedly resistant to categorization. It wasn't trust. He didn't trust people, not as a personal failing, but as a professional discipline, the same way a structural engineer doesn't trust a bridge simply because it appears solid. It wasn't wariness, exactly. She hadn't threatened him. She hadn't even implied she could. It was something closer to recognition. The particular, slightly vertiginous sensation of encountering an intelligence that operated at a frequency you'd previously assumed was yours alone. He started the engine and drove back into the city. The encrypted channel buzzed at 11:47 p.m. Not a name. A file. He opened it at his desk, the penthouse quiet around him, the Han River silver-black through the windows. The file was dense, transaction records, a partial transcript of 3 separate calls, and a photograph taken from a distance with a long lens, slightly grainy, but clear enough. He looked at the photograph for a long time. The figure in it was someone he had known for 6 years. Someone he had, if he was being precise with himself, trusted more than almost anyone in his organization. Someone who had been present at meetings, who had access to infrastructure most of his people didn't even know existed, who had eaten at his table on 3 separate occasions and spoken with easy familiarity about loyalty and discretion. Park Young-seo, his logistics director. The photograph showed Young-seo at a cafe in Songpa, across from a man Kangmin recognized from Bomi's earlier documentation as a Haesong courier. Between them on the table, half obscured by a coffee cup, a drive.
Small.
Matte gray. The kind used for encrypted document transfer. Beneath the photograph, a single line of text from Bomi. Transfer confirmed. The courier leaves Seoul tomorrow at 1400 hours. What you do now is yours to decide.
Up.
Kangmin set down his phone and stood very still. 6 years. He had constructed enormous amounts of trust over 6 years, and trust, for a man in his position, wasn't a feeling, it was infrastructure. It was the load-bearing element that everything else rested on. Without it, the entire architecture of his operation became unstable, every assumption suddenly questionable, every relationship suddenly a potential fracture point. This was, operationally, a crisis. But it was something else, too, and Kangmin, despite himself, was aware of the something else. He was thinking about the woman in the gray-walled room, about the fact that she had spent 11 months watching his operation, learning its rhythms, understanding its architecture, and that in all that time, she had found one point of failure and come to him with it instead of leveraging it against him. About the particular quality of her attention, not predatory, not opportunistic. Analytical, yes. But underneath that, something more difficult to name. Something almost like stewardship. She had treated his world, which most people either feared or coveted, as a subject worthy of genuine understanding. He didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, he went back. He didn't message ahead. He simply drove to the building in Mapo, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the gray door. There was a longer pause than the previous time. Then,
Come in.
She was at the desk again, but the energy in the room was different. Some of the wall documentation had been taken down and organized into flat files. She was in the process of packing, methodical, precise, each item assessed and placed with the focused care of someone who had learned to travel light by necessity. She looked at him when he entered. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, but a kind of recalibration. "You got the file," she said. "I got the file." He remained near the door, hands in the pockets of his coat. "You're leaving." "When an engagement concludes, I move," she said simply. "It's how I stay viable." "Where?" She tilted her head slightly. "That's not typically information I share."
I'm asking anyway.
The room was quiet. She set down the item she'd been holding, a hard drive, small and matte gray, similar to the one in the photograph, which created an odd, doubling sensation in his chest, and turned to face him fully. "Why?" she asked. Not defensively. With the genuine directness he was beginning to understand, was simply how she communicated. He found, to his own considerable discomfort, that he didn't have an immediate answer. "I want to retain you," he said finally. "Formally. Your own terms." She studied him for a moment. "I don't embed. I've had those offers before. I work independently, because independence is what makes the work valid. If I'm on your payroll, My analysis of your operation becomes advocacy. That's not useful to you. You have plenty of advocates. What you don't have is someone who tells you true things. I'm not asking you to advocate, he said. I'm asking you to continue doing exactly what you've been doing. With compensation. With resources. And proximity, she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply an observation, the kind she made with the same neutrality she applied to transaction records and satellite images. He didn't deny it. She turned back to her packing, but her movements had slowed. She picked up the hard drive again, turned it in her hands. Mr. John, she said, I've studied you for 11 months. I know how you evaluate people. I know what you look for and what you discount. A pause. I want you to understand, capable of understanding it, which is not a small thing, that I am aware of how I appear. I know what assumptions people make when they see me. I know which rooms go quiet, which offers evaporate, which respect curdles into something else the moment I walk through a door. She said it without bitterness, without the particular bruised quality of someone still raw from the wounds. She said it the way she said everything, with the settled clarity of someone who had looked at something directly, processed it completely, and decided to keep moving. I've built my entire career on the fact that most people underestimate me immediately and irreversibly, she continued. I want to know, before we have any further conversation about arrangements, whether you are one of those people. Because I'd rather know now. The air in the room felt charged. Kangmin looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the phone call at 2:47 a.m., about the voice that had immediately, instinctively, commanded his full attention, about the room covered in documentation representing 11 months of solitary, disciplined work that had protected his operation from a threat his own organization hadn't detected, about the way she spoke, to him, without a single glance toward the door, without a single word calibrated to soften an edge. I drove myself here, he said. Both times. I've discussed operational details I've never shared with my most senior people. I delayed a significant logistical transfer on the basis of a phone call from an unknown number. He paused. When have I ever behaved as though I underestimate you? Something passed across her face. Brief. Complicated. The expression of someone who had prepared themselves for a particular answer and received a different one. She set the hard drive down. I need 48 hours to think, she said. You can have them. He was almost at the door when she spoke again. Mr. John. He stopped, hand near the frame. The person who handed Yongseo to Haesong's courier, the data broker who initiated this whole chain 18 months ago. A pause, measured and deliberate. He doesn't work for Haesong. He works for someone much closer to you. Someone whose name isn't in any of the documentation I've shared with you yet. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He turned back slowly. What are you saying? Her eyes met his with a steady, unwavering directness he was already beginning to think of as specifically, uniquely hers. I'm saying Yongseo isn't the end of this. He's the middle. She held his gaze. And whoever sits at the beginning of this chain has been in your organization longer than 6 years. Much longer. A beat. That's what the next 48 hours are for. For me to decide whether I trust you enough to tell you who it is. He walked down 4 flights of stairs and back out into a Seoul morning that looked exactly the same as it had 40 minutes ago. The same gray sky, the same river-damp breeze threading through the Mapo streets, the same city going about its layered, indifferent business. But the ground beneath Kangmin's feet felt entirely different. 15 years. He had spent 15 years believing that the walls of what he'd built were solid, that the foundation was sound, that the people inside it were known quantities, assessed, tested, positioned precisely according to what they were. And somewhere inside that structure, in a place he hadn't thought to look, something had been slowly, quietly, patiently working against him. He thought about Bomi in that room, the cot in the back, the 2 empty coffee cups. 11 months of solitary work in a building where nobody knew her name. He thought about her question. Are you one of those people? He thought about his answer. And then he thought, with the specific disquiet of a man confronting a very large and very real thing, that he had just handed an enormous amount of power to a woman he had known for less than 48 hours. and that the part of his mind that had never been wrong about people, not once in 15 years, wasn't afraid of that at all. When Bomi finally reveals the name at the root of the conspiracy, the one person Kangmin has trusted longer than anyone, do you think he'll be able to act on it? Or has something already shifted inside him that will make the hardest decision of his life even harder? Tell me in the comments, who do you think the person at the beginning of the chain really is, and how deep does the betrayal go?